welcome to everybody here in person. Welcome to everybody online. I'm really delighted to be hosting this, the second of our Margaret Anstee seminars. Ilias gave the first. I'm really thrilled that we're talking about Palestine, that we have two exceptional scholars for their work on Palestine. Now feels a very good moment to be bringing that voice and scholarship and presence to Newnham and to the Margaret Anstee Centre. So Fadia and Mesna decided to do a two-hander, which is really wonderful, and I think in some ways is emblematic of the collaboration and the conversation that we try to provoke in the college and in the Margaret Anstee Centre. And Fadia is going to speak for a few minutes to set the scene, and then she will give her part of the talk and then hand over to Mesna, and then they're going to have a conversation between themselves for a few moments before handing over to the audience. We think we're aiming for an hour and a quarter before breaking, so just to give you that. A little bit of housekeeping. We're not expecting a fire alarm, so if one goes off, do make your way briskly onto Citric Avenue, apparently. The loos are round through the doors over there and to the right, if anyone needs them. Anything else? No?
I think we're ready to start.
Wonderful. Over to Fadia and Mesna.
Thank you. No, let's not. Do you want to sit here? No? You can sit. Oh, no, you sit here. Sorry. Now that we are seated, thank you so much, Emma, for the introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this conversation on land and agrarian questions in Palestine. So I'm just going to start very briefly with an introduction on the agrarian question. What is the agrarian question and how it is still relevant today? Yeah. So the agrarian question has probably been one of the most important debates in the social sciences over the last century. For the large part of the 20th century, the agrarian question was concerned with the role of agriculture in the development of capitalism, and how the rise of capitalism and empires had historically transformed the countryside. This question, that is also known as the classical agrarian question, was however considered no longer relevant in the context of neoliberal globalization. And therefore, it was declared dead in the early 2000s by some prominent scholars such as Henry Burstein. But the debate didn't end there. Not even after a decade, the agrarian question reemerged in less dogmatic and structuralist forms around a new set of questions that include the question of financialization of land and food, GMOs and technology, urbanization, labor migration, climate change, the list is long, gender and social reproduction, as well as the unfinished nature of colonialism. So some scholars have estimated that at the moment there are around 7 agrarian questions. What we would like to do today is to discuss with you what Palestine can tell us about these questions, and at the same time, what these questions can tell us about Palestine. So before starting this conversation, I would like to introduce you a couple of concepts that I think can be useful to understand the agrarian question in Palestine. I think they can offer some kind of scaffolding. So the first concept that I would like to introduce is the one of settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is a distinct type of colonialism. It's described by the Australian scholar Patrick Wolfe as a structural process aimed at taking control of as much territory as possible with the least number of people on it. Now, how this process takes place, how it is done, it's open to debate. It can take different forms, and it is carried out through different mechanisms. This can be positive mechanisms such as assimilation and recognition, but also negative mechanisms such as war and genocide. Now, because we describe settler colonialism as a territorial project and process, it's important to understand what we mean by territory and what we mean by territory in relation to land. So land and territory are two different yet interconnected concepts. The land is a complex object, is a material and economic, social and political object that is shaped and shapes the social relations that connect people to each other. While territory refers to the political authority that is exerted over the land, so over a certain geographical space. Now, both our presentations today are going to focus on land and agrarian question in what is territorially regarded as the West Bank that you can see here on the map. I'm now going to move into my presentation and into the work that I've done over the last years with Palestinian rural communities in the West Bank. So during my PhD and also at the beginning of my postdoc, so last summer, I spent quite a lot of time with Palestinian rural communities to explore how Palestinian small-scale farmers produce their food and through which cultivation practices, how they organize the farm, the labor on the farm, but also how they make a living under changing political, economic, and environmental circumstances. So what I'm going to share with you today are snapshots of this work that I think can help us to think with and through the Palestinian agrarian question. So the way I built my presentation is around a series of pictures that I've taken during field work across different sites of the West Bank that will guide us in exploring the dynamics of agrarian change from the 1980s to the present. So I would like to start with this picture that I took south of Jerusalem, so in the southern rural hinterland of Jerusalem. You can see Jerusalem in the background, and what you can see in the front, actually, it's a landscape made of olive trees in the front, and in the back you have pine trees. So this might seem at first sight a landscape like any other in the Mediterranean. Yet, as the Israeli scholar Iris Braverman has pointed out, this landscape is not as random or natural as it first seems. So what's the story behind this landscape? And this is it has been part of my work over the last years to understand what's in there, what are the kind of social relations and processes that compose this landscape and that have composed this landscape over the last decades. So very briefly, this landscape came into being at the end of the 1980s when Palestinian rural communities started a massive campaign of olive tree planting. So olive trees were already there before the 1980s, of course, but in the 80s, they started a massive campaign planting thousands and thousands of olive trees all across the West Bank. And they did so in response to the Israeli state land doctrine that was adopted by the Israeli state in 1979. Now, very briefly, what's the state land doctrine? The state land doctrine is based on the principle that any uncultivated land in the West Bank that remains unused for a certain period of time can be considered as state property unless the person who claims ownership of the land can prove otherwise. Now, the problem is that most of the lands in the West Bank are untitled and still remain untitled. So cultivation has become, from the 1980s, the basis for land appropriation. And overall, between 1979 and 1992, the Israeli state took control of around 16% of the West Bank by declaring this land as state lands. Now, if we go back to these pictures, while Palestinians, they were planting olive trees in reaction to this state land policy, lands that were declared as state property were planted by the Israeli state with pine trees, that somehow these pine trees become a claim over territory. So it becomes a presence on the territory. In other cases, lands that were used by Palestinian rural communities for grazing and planting grain-fed crops, as the hill that you can see here in the background, they were used to build Israeli settlements. So the one that you can see here is the Israeli settlement of Beitar Illit, which is one of the biggest in the West Bank, and that was built on the lands of the village of Wadi Fukin in the 2000s. So now I'm going to look at what happens in terms of cultivation practices for the farmers who have lost access to most of their agricultural lands. And I'll take here the case of Wadi Fukin to look at how Palestinian villagers, as a result of land lost, first of all, they started working in Israel as wage labor, mainly in the agricultural and construction sectors. And so most of them, they started relying on wage labor as main source of livelihood at the end of the 80s. However, with a major change that happened around the period of the Oslo agreements that transformed political and economic relations rather than, so they restructured rather than transforming these political and economic relations, most of these men were no longer able to work in Israel as a result of Israeli closure policies. And so they found them to plant and to cultivate the land in even smaller plots than before. So in this context of rapid decline of land availability and increasing livelihood precariousness due to agricultural restrictions and Israeli restrictions on agriculture and closure of the Israeli market, many small-scale farmers started adopting capital-intensive techniques of cultivation such as hybrid seeds, drip irrigation and greenhouses, and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. These new farming techniques were presented by local and international NGOs as a technical solution to the problem of reduced land availability. And villagers, even if at the beginning they were somehow reticent to replace their local seeds and to plant hybrid seeds and to introduce new cropping techniques, they started, however, to plant tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers into the greenhouses that you can see in the picture, with the hope that they could increase their agricultural productivity and profitability. In other cases, small-scale farmers have sought to increase agricultural productivity and land profitability by shifting the core of their farm activity from vegetables to monocropping of high-value, water-intensive crops such as avocados and other tropical fruits that are then sold especially on international markets, and especially they go into the Arab world, so mainly to the Gulf. So overall, the adoption of such market-based cultivation practices has enabled farmers to raise farm productivity in the short term. However, the problem in the long term is that such market-based cultivation practices are generating a process of farm and social differentiation, with certain small-scale farmers losing access to the remaining agricultural lands because of land privatization, debt, market competition, and decreased land fertility. And while this is not historically new nor specific to the West Bank, what processes of farm and social differentiation in the Palestinian rural highlands show us is that adopting a model of agricultural development that isolates the question of production from the question of social reproduction can only further aggravate problems of land access, food availability, and rural inequalities in a region that is already plagued by the problem of ongoing settler colonialism. So I would like now to end on a more positive note, introducing you to the case, so the farm of Sulaiman, that was established in 2017 as part of a growing movement for agroecology and food sovereignty in the West Bank. This movement emerged in and against the uneven dynamics of agrarian change that articulations of settler colonialism and neoliberal capitalism have produced over the last decades in the West Bank. The movement consists mainly of agroecological farming cooperatives, seeds banks, and other farm-to-table community projects. One of these projects is Sulaiman Farm, that in English translates as a ladybug, that has been the first community-supported agriculture project to be established in the West Bank. It was established on a small piece of land by a group of young people in what were lands that were no longer used after the establishment of the separation wall and of the settlement that you can see in the background of the picture. So these young people, they somehow reclaimed the land and they started producing on these lands organically without using any fertilizers or chemicals, and reproducing their own seeds and exchanging them with other farmers across the West Bank. Using rain feed and irrigated cropping techniques, and selling their products directly to farms members or to urban farmer markets, as the one that you can see here in the picture. So the picture is announcing a farmer market that is taking place in Ramallah. And as argued by Mohab, who is the founder of Sulaiman Farm, and here I quote, for small farmers like us, agroecology is more suitable to the context. It guarantees independence, and it is the future of food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is both a concept and a growing global social movement that seeks to transform the current food system by reclaiming farmers' capacity to control locally available resources, so that they don't have to rely on international corporations to get access to seeds, farming inputs, and food. What I think is interesting about this growing food sovereignty movement in the West Bank is that while reaffirming the centrality of the question of the land in the Palestinian agrarian question, it also opens a new set of questions around the Palestinian agrarian question and the place that we should give into the Palestinian agrarian question to issues of ecology, social reproduction, and agricultural development. Thank you very much.
No. One moment, please. Technical difficulties. We can find the presentation. It's here. It's here. There it is.
You clicked it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Yes.
Oh, you can use the pointer if you. It's connected.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Fadia. It's so exciting to hear you speak about your work. I've been, every time I hear it, it's really enriching in all these kinds of ways, and it starts hitting my synapses, and I start thinking about all sorts of other things. So thank you. I actually love that you ended with social reproduction, because that's what I'm going to take up. I am a historian by training, so slightly my methodology, I think, will also come in as well in this conversation. But I want to talk about the Khaduri School. And this is a school that was established in 1929, 1930 in my hometown of Tulkarem in the northern West Bank. I was born and raised in Tulkarem. So, and in my grandparents' home, this diploma has hung as far as, from as long as I can remember. It's a diploma of my grandfather, Khalil al-Qatu, and his graduation from the school, the Khaduri Agricultural School of Tulkarem. I'll come back to this diploma because it's a little bit more than that. And, it's sort of, anytime I visited my grandparents, this sort of diploma would just be there. And I wondered about it, and I wondered about this institution that was actually really just kind of down the road from where I was born. And I would walk by it all the time. So a little bit about this institution. So the Khadouri Agricultural School was founded as a bequeathment from Sir Ellis Khadouri, who is an Iraqi Jewish merchant who made his wealth first in Bombay and then in Hong Kong. The Khadouri family became quite storied in the history of 20th century development, particularly in East Asia and in Hong Kong in particular, but also southern China. They were the primary engine for the electrification of southern China, in fact. They are now owners, this is extremely wealthy now philanthropic family, but also quite philanthropic across the century. So Ellis Khadouri died relatively young, but he bequeathed to the Directorate of Education of the British Mandate in Palestine 150 Palestine pounds for the establishment of some educational project in the country. The initial idea by Humphrey Bowman, who was Director of Education at the time, was for the establishment of an agricultural college for Arabs and Jews to learn about modern agriculture and modern farming techniques. This proposal was rejected by the Jewish Agency, who were unwilling to have an institution shared with the quote Arabs, i.e. Palestinians of the time. So in compromise, the bequeathment was divided in half. There is a Khadouri school now in in Nazareth on Mount Tabor that has become an engine for the education of some of the earliest Israeli leadership. Rabin was educated there, Yigal Alon, major generals, major ministers, etc. But then there was the slightly less supported Khadouri school in Tulkeren. This institution, in fact, had a slightly different and older history. In the late Ottoman period and in the early British period, British Mandate period, i.e. after 1919 or so, Palestinian peasants in the area, in fact, were beginning to demand their own agricultural training institute. And this land, their British town planning at the time, began to develop and think about which parcels of land in Tulkeren would be appropriate for this school. And so there's been multiple drafts of mappings of different pieces of land and parcels of land. The idea being that an agricultural school leads a large tracts of land for large different kinds of agricultural products in a town that is largely made up of small shareholders and sharecroppers. But in quite fertile part of Palestine, and in a part that is adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea, only 8 kilometers inland from the Mediterranean Sea, but also only 8 kilometers or 10 kilometers from the hinterlands and highlands of Nablus, i.e. Primary olive production in the north. And so on one side, primary olive and production, and on the other side, the fertile northern citrus groves of Palestine. The 120,000, or no, the half, 60,000 pounds, went towards the building of the primary central building of Khadouri, which is this building, which still stands. And the land was in fact donated by the peasants themselves. Their investment was such in this school that they donated parcels of their land. And there's what's so interesting to me about this. I mean, I should say that I have been at work at this, and I'll talk about this in the Q&A, but it is very hard to get this information, in fact, partly because the families that had donated this land themselves didn't realize that they had donated it. That due to the Nakba, due to the 1948 war, due to the 1967 war, paper trails had disappeared. And I will talk a little bit about the disappearance of the paper trails, my recovery of them. There's a bit of a story of ash and dust and going through scraps and stuff. But just to kind of, that these kinds of images were produced through a lot of piecemeal archival retrieval rather than a kind of linear story that was sort of unfurled before me by some sort of storyteller, readily available with all the sorts of documents that I needed. But anyway, so this is the central building on which Khadouri was founded. From the very beginning, this was a school that had as its central ethos the production of the modern Palestinian peasants, the modern Palestinian fallah. And the idea is that so the kibbutz goes, which is the Israeli version of agricultural production, so must the Palestinian modern agricultural production go. And in fact, there was central to it from the very beginning, this relationship always between literacy, education, the sort of the importance of abstract thinking, quantification, etc., and agricultural training. The science of agriculture was central to training of these, mostly, actually, until 1954, only young men. The first two, so my grandfather was was part of the first cohort of young men in 1929, and my other grandfather was the third cohort. And there has never not been a member of the Cato family who has been part of the school over the last century. There has always been a Cato at the Khadouri school until now. I have cousins who go there now. And one continuity across that century has been this relationship between farming, development, self-cultivation, land cultivation, and schooling and literacy and intellectual leadership. They were meant to be truly the agricultural leadership of Palestine. That was the purpose of the Khadouri school. This also meant that it was a site of really innovative experimentation, in particular with dairy production. Two things. First, it was one of the first sites in Palestine that experimented with cow's milk, because by and large, Palestine, as in the region, utilizes sheep's milk, ewe's milk, goat's milk. So cow's milk was a bit newer in Palestine. They began to have such a successful dairy production industry that they became this like before artisanal was a thing. They were an artisanal export. They had a bit of an export industry in dairy to the region that in fact was a good part of their budget for quite a while, for about 30 to 40 years. This actually only stopped, dairy production in Khadouri only stopped in 2005 for reasons that I'll explain in a second. They were also remained farmers. So by and large, they also would go back to their own land, their land of their parents or of their families or their clans or their villages, and utilize the knowledge that they were gaining in Khadouri during the harvest seasons and the cultivation seasons in their own land. So the semester of Khadouri was, the terms of schooling were all bound up with harvesting seasons. And this, sort of created for it in exceptionalism to the other schooling that was happening elsewhere in the country. However, despite the fact that it was a school for the training of the modern fallah, the modern peasant, it was also they were not only at the beck and call of British imperial educators, not at all. In fact, they were, due to this rising sense of themselves as part of the leadership of the rural leadership of the country, central to resistance to British Empire. These are the stables of Khadouri, and that is my grandfather as a 20-year-old member of during the Palestinian revolt and the general strike between 1936 and 1939 against British rule. And I, ignorant me, first I thought that was a donkey. I'm terrible. Anyway, I was like, when did Grandpa have an Arabian horse? That's so expensive. And then somebody was like, yeah, that's the colleges. That he'd like had a little photo up, but that is his gun that he lost in 1967 as a result of the occupation, because he had to destroy it before the Israeli soldiers entered to get him, because that's when the West Bank was occupied. But until that time, that's a First World War rifle. And him and his homie were taking a little pose, but he was part of the team in Khadouri that ran resistance operations that spanned from Tulkarem and this area of Palestine all the way down to Jaffa and southern Palestine. So he was this end of it, and the citrus growers were at the other end on the Jaffa ports. So this was also a site then where villagers and rural and peasants and farmers and workers were gathering at this Khadouri school to learn to cultivate themselves as also revolutionaries, just as much as they were cultivating themselves as new fallahs. This is Khadouri now-ish, before October, actually. It's a thriving polytechnic that is run, it is the sole state school in Palestine. Every other university in Palestine is actually governed by a board of trustees and is semi-private or and public, except Khadouri, which is under the direct control of the Palestinian Authority. As such, Khadouri now is a university, it's a polytechnic that is the primary educator of a new class of Palestinian: the orphans, the former prisoners, the children of former prisoners, and those who have, and working class Palestinians who could not otherwise afford university. The ethos that it began with was transformed historically across the last 100 years in many different ways, and I can talk about its post-Nakba life, but until now, it remains that school of the cultivation of the marginalized. This is the same grandfather, later on, just a year before his death. That's me posing, but my sister's on his lap. And any story I ever heard about Khadouri, which were quite, he was a bit of a taciturn man. He wasn't particularly, talkative. But anytime he talked about Khadouri, which was literally just down the road, was about his love for this institution, about this complicated relationship with his schoolmasters there, but also about how this school offered him a way out of the drudgery of farming. And that this was a school that provided him, as a man who had inherited from his family giant parcels of land, but lost them all during the Nakba, during the 1948 war, the possibility of surviving and in fact flourishing despite devastation. In fact, he often talks about how Khaduri, and he always said his gratitude towards Khaduri, and in fact to the Khaduri family, who are beloved in Tulkarm, and are storied as these legends who, I mean, I've talked to the Khaduri family and visited them in Hong Kong and talked about this, and they've been quite isolated from the school, but they were quite pleased and chuffed that they are still remembered there. That it provided this community and this town and Palestinian society at large with the possibility of social change and social regeneration despite war. After the Nakba, in fact, the piece of the school that was about teacher training expanded exponentially, and a good chunk of the export labor of Palestinians after 1948 was trained in Khaduri to be teachers. The 500,000 Palestinians that ended up, for example, in the Gulf as both agricultural managers and school teachers were either trained to Khaduri or Khaduri-like institutions that popped up in the 1950s across the West Bank, particularly in Ramallah and in Jerusalem. So I want to end it with there, and I'm happy to clarify, take another questions